Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through Scottish Prism midweek specials. This is the one where we don't concentrate so much in Scotland, although we really are. As you can see, the title of this podcast is Irish Election, Scotland's Opportunity. And I'll go into that later, but there's a couple of other things we've got to discuss before that. But let me get in. People are going to assist me today. So starting with our Lloyd over there in Edinburgh. Welcome back, Lloyd.
Good to be back, Roddy. Good to be back.
Good. You were missed, my friend, as always missed. Great to have you back.
Very thank you.
And over there in the Emerald Isle, we've got our dear friend and regular Finbar Markey.
Hi, Scotland.
Finbar.
How are you?
Good. Well, we're always pleased to see you. It's nice to get. It's been too long since we last saw you.
It is. I thought I was on the naughty stool for a while there.
No, you're not. What was it? Events, dear boy. Events, as Harold Gold said. Yes, events. And that's the last reference to Tory you get on this show. So we're on here to ostensibly, Finbar, talk about the Irish election. I want to get onto that because it does have a knock-on effect to Scotland. In fact, it's probably actually, of all the elections round about us, including the one in England, the Irish was probably the most relevant to Scotland, but more on that later. But your other expertise was, of course, is what's been going on in Ukraine with Russia and Ukraine. This week, I'm getting alarmed. I don't know if any of you saw this little beauty, where Russia apparently is now, getting shelters out there for the people. Something they're not doing in the UK. Mobile nuclear shelters designed to protect the civilians from radiation and nuclear explosions, etc. Now, if the Russians are doing that, Finbar, and of course we know that Biden gave permission, and of course Starmer and Macron then they joined in to send, and the Russians have warned if you use long-range missiles into Russian territory, they will see it as an act of war. Should we be worried, or is it just all everyone beating chests here?
I think there's an element of chest beating in it. I think Biden is going to commit a few final acts to make it very difficult for Trump. I think when we look, I don't think it's coincidental, and I know you might call me conspiracy theory, but I don't think it's coincidental that COVID happened at the beginning of the last Trump presidency. And here we have, or well into it, I should say, here we have another situation where the Trump presidency is about to be inaugurated in January. And we have a situation where escalation on the part of the Democrats seems to be ramping up. In terms of the impact and import and the possible or potential change in terms of the warfare that's happening in Eastern Europe at the moment, I'm not sure. So APN News this morning put out a report allegedly from Putin saying that Vladimir Putin has stated this morning that Russia will view the use of long-range missiles attacking Russia if they are operated by personnel from NATO countries or countries that possess nuclear weapons, that they will see that as an act of war beyond the Ukrainian borders themselves. So I'm not sure even if Putin said that. We've had stories in the Washington Post, the New York Times over the last few weeks, which are pure rubbish. Hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops in the Kursk region. Absolutely no evidence whatsoever of it. Phone calls between Trump and Putin that never happened. Phone calls between Elon Musk and Iran that never happened. So in terms of even what the Russian reaction, unless you see it coming from Putin's mouth himself, I wouldn't necessarily believe it. But here's the thing. We know, the Russians know, that there has been NATO personnel operating in Ukraine, not since just 2022, since 2013/14, and since the coup in the so-called Maidan revolution, the coup in Kiev in 2014. So we know that they are operating there. Already the Ukrainians have been launching far into Russia drone strikes, far beyond, northwards of Moscow. They hit an oil plant or an energy plant north of Moscow a few months ago. So the idea of long-range strikes in themselves into Russia are not that new. The idea of NATO personnel on the ground in Ukraine is not that new. I have heard the Russians talk about red lines before. Those lines were crossed, but we still didn't go into a nuclear exchange of any sort. I think the Russians are fully aware that Trump is coming, if you want to put it that way, in a month and a few weeks, and that they have to hold on to see what the new policy objectives of the Trump administration are. I recall Putin actually saying a few weeks ago, and saw him saying this a few weeks ago, that there will be more likelihood and opportunity to a negotiated peace with a new, he didn't name Trump, but he said with a new administration in the United States. So I'm not sure whether this is a little bit of bluster on the part of Biden. We haven't seen any of those long-range ballistic strikes into Russia that is being threatened now, or that the permission has been given to carry out. So let's wait and see. I think it's a lot of bluster, and I think the Russians are very, very conservative. They're very, very considered and pragmatic in their approach to absolutely everything. They won't knee-jerk react if such a strike occurs. And remember, they're waiting to see what the Trump reaction is. Trump is going to come down harder on Iran, no doubt. He's going to come down harder on Hezbollah. He's going to come down harder on all Palestinian militant groups. But I think he's going to make peace in Ukraine. Though even when they say make peace, the war is definitely lost at this stage. And I know on this program over the last 2+ years, we've been speaking about the war being lost. But I think we've all been surprised that the NATO countries have been willing to empty their armory stocks to supply Ukraine, and that has surprised us. We know now that stocks are empty. We know now that the West does not have the production capacity to maintain what they're providing to Ukraine and to Israel at the moment. And any further escalation in either direction is going to be severely problematic. I'm not overly concerned about it. I think it was a bit of saber rattling. I'm not too convinced that we're going to have a lot of people. I think World War III was trending on Twitter yesterday, but I don't think this is a precursor to World War III. It is an abstract escalation because nothing has actually happened yet physically with long-range ballistic strikes into Russia. If it happens, we can reassess again. I've got a feeling it's not going to happen. If it does, it'll be performative more than anything else at this stage.
Yeah, I've heard that they're talking about firing them into Kursk, and that is a battle zone. So I don't know. I mean, I hope it's not. But the other thing is, the Russians were talking this week about they hit another place where there was NATO personnel they knew. And lo and behold, the following day, the Americans announced that 6 Special Ops Marines had died in a helicopter accident in the Mediterranean, which is one of the
there's those asymmetrical approaches, and we've heard that it's language. It's new language to those who are not fully au fait and fully informed about warfare nomenclature and language. But over the last few years, we have heard phrases like symmetrical and asymmetrical responses. So a symmetrical response would be if they fire a ballistic missile at a target in one of our cities, we'll fire one back at their cities. An asymmetrical response might be that if they fire a ballistic missile into Russia, Russia might decide to do something on the other side of the world that looks slightly unconnected to the actual attack that they're responding to, but it is still an attack. It's an asymmetric response to it. Listen, it's all wait and see, I think, really, isn't it?
Well, any luck, they might hit Tel Aviv or something and then say to America, "How'd you like that?" But on these things about Finbar alluded to, Lloyd, about the distortions and the lies they tell us, and they've been telling us, I mean, our whole lives and everything, but it's particularly got worse since October the 7th in Israel and since the special military operation and the Maidan coup in 2014. But this went to new heights with Mark Rubio, Trump's new Secretary of State, his Blinken replacement. There is no replacement. This is just absolute gaslighting. Please listen to this.
Talking about escalatory tactics, the stunning new leaks in the Nord Stream pipelines connecting Europe to Russia. Western intelligence officials say they were likely caused by underwater explosions. President Biden called it a deliberate attack of sabotage. Does the U.S. have evidence that Russia is responsible?
Well, I'm not going to comment on whatever intelligence products they've produced or had. I think logic and common sense will tell you that these things don't blow up on their own, especially in strategic and key points. Someone has to know where the vulnerabilities are, and someone has to have the capability to go down there and do it. So there's only a handful of countries that do. I doubt very seriously that the Chinese are involved in it, although I'm not a fan of the Chinese Communist Party. I wouldn't go as far as to accuse them of doing that. I think it's pretty clear. Someone did this, and the only people in that region who have both the motive and the capability to have done it are Russian or Russian forces. So I think for me, it's not an intelligence matter at this point. It's a common sense matter.
Quite ridiculous, Lloyd. I mean, for a start, if Russia had wanted to stop supply, all they had to do was switch off the tap at their end. But the problem is so many people will believe that because this is a respected member of Mr. Trump's cabinet.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Roddy, that interview's from before he was announced into his new job. So in actual fact, what we just watched is Marco Rubio's job interview for the job that Trump gave him. That's really what that was. Can I just go back a little bit? Because while you and Finbar were talking, I earwigged to the news. Ukraine fired 6 of these missiles this morning. This is what we're, sorry to spoil the illusion, but we're recording on Tuesday afternoon. People will see this on Wednesday. So it's after nearly 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, and Ukraine has fired 6 missiles. What they're not saying, though, is what kind of missiles they were. And apparently they've landed in the Bryansk region. And there appear to be secondary explosions from the report that I've just heard. I think also it's interesting that today Sergei Lavrov, who is in South America for the summit, chose to have a press conference in his hotel this morning outlining Russia's new statement on their nuclear use protocols, which are markedly different from the past. Now, I agree, partly because I want it to be true, but also because it makes sense with just about everything Finbar said. I think the Russians have an understanding of what war really means that most politicians in the West have no concept of. They really don't understand. Russia lost 20 million people in the Second World War, and that's a spectre that hangs over them. It's a clear part of their history. There's a knowledge, and a real knowledge of what the horror of war really brings, which is why Russia has not engaged in, fanciful colonial wars to the same extent as the British and the Americans have subsequent to the Second World War. But what concerns me most of all about this whole situation at the moment is the way the mainstream Western media is beginning to attempt to normalize the concept of nuclear war, the concept of a nuclear exchange. I mean, how far have we come that our people are now so uneducated that they believe it's possible for there to be limited nuclear war, when all the science tells us that that's not the case? And in actual fact, the military doctrines around the world, particularly now with this new development in the Russian military doctrine, nothing can be controlled. If you open fire, someone else opens fire. And remembering there are so many separate nuclear states, this is not directly necessarily about Russia and the United States. Something goes wrong, India becomes involved. India has intercontinental nuclear ballistic missiles. So does Pakistan. So does North Korea. So does Britain. So does France. So does Israel. In the situation we're in at the moment, even the suggestion from the media or the suggestion from any politician that there is the possibility that you can move up to a limited nuclear war without it ending up in an all-out nuclear war and effectively the destruction of humanity as we understand it is deeply, deeply frightening. Because these, limited nuclear exchange, I heard some BBC reporter use the other day. And I felt like strangling him. I mean, explain to me, what is a limited nuclear exchange? When has one ever happened? How do you know what will happen? How do you know what the overall the broader consequences of a limited nuclear exchange would be, when in reality nuclear weapons have been used in a military context only twice in human history, and both of them were used in Japan at the end of the Second World War. Those weapons are radically different. They're like comparing a banger, a firework banger, with a 2,000-pound bomb. These things they're completely different. If we base all our understanding on what nuclear exchange would be like based on what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then we are getting it radically wrong. The worrying thing here, and I keep saying it, we have to be honest about what nuclear war actually means. Maybe, it's nearly 2 generations now since we had a real examination of the nature of nuclear war and nuclear conflict, and indeed the dangers of nuclear power in the United Kingdom. But it now would appear that across the world, all of these things have been forgotten. Have we forgotten Chernobyl? Have we forgotten about the damage that and that wasn't military. A fire in a nuclear power station resulted in X number of countries being unable to take up their agricultural goods. Land all over the world, including here in Scotland, where you were not allowed to farm on because it was contaminated by a fire from a nuclear power station, not an explosion of a nuclear weapon. Sorry, I'm ranting on here, but we need to get this in perspective. Nuclear exchange will result in millions upon millions of people dying, and possibly, quite likely, the end of the human race as we understand it.
It is a worry. You did say the politicians, you would think they all know the science behind it. But they all know the science behind male and female. That didn't stop them going down a rabbit hole with that one. So I wouldn't count on them knowing the science.
It's even the expression, isn't it, of one side saying we'll have a limited nuclear exchange. How do you know how the other side is going to respond? This idea, we initiated this thinking that we were only going to fire 3 nuclear weapons, but they fired 50 back, so we fired 100 back. It's just ludicrous. The language, everything about it is ludicrous. These people, and again, as you say, I think, Lloyd, you're right, that when they look at nuclear conflict or atomic bomb conflict, as it once was in Japan, they probably look back, these uneducated saps who had millions spent on their education, and they seem to have inverted intelligence. So they look at Japan and they say, well, Japan got over it, didn't they? Japan got over it. So everybody will get over it. It's just a blip in history. I think that's the way they view it.
One of the things they're saying, Finbar, is that possibly with these long-range missiles, because apparently the main thrust of the
Get the water. 1 second, guys.
Sorry. Well, I'll put it to you then, Lloyd. One of the main points of this incursion apparently was to take the nuclear power station and exchange it for the other one in Zaporozhye. I can't pronounce Zaporozhye. But the other thing they've said is that this one doesn't have a protective dome, and if it's hit with a missile, we get a Chernobyl. If they fire one of them, Russia's hit with a dirty bomb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from the very beginning of this, Ukraine has been playing a kind of Russian, for want of a better description, Russian roulette with the nuclear power stations. Right from the very beginning, there were the shellings of the nuclear power stations. Then there were the accusations that Russia was shelling the nuclear power stations, and all of this seemed to be a kind of attempt at intimidation. And in some ways, attacks on nuclear power stations in that particular area, particularly Ukraine, Russia, they remember the fallout from Chernobyl, literal fallout from Chernobyl, very, very well. And I think they understand that nuclear power stations are effectively, as you said, Roddy, a giant, big, dirty bomb. And if you can get that to go off, then you don't have to actually have nuclear weapons. And I think that's something that people should really, really consider, especially, slightly off topic, but, these considerations that we're going to build new nuclear power stations in our country, pay attention. These things become counters in a game. These things become, potential for blackmail in themselves.
I think isn't there a fascist approach to some of this, that you can do whatever you want because what matters is who wins. They write the history. It's about strength. And so when we talk about what we spoke about earlier about Biden giving permission for the Ukrainians to launch these long-range ballistic missiles, I think one of the biggest threats that would pose is that they would in fact try to strike a nuclear plant deep inside Russia with missiles that are 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pound bombs essentially. And I think that is the key fear, rather than a military exchange in which the Russians will lose. It's that key worry. And we do know, look what's happening in Palestine at the moment. The world appears to be powerless to do anything about it. And if the Ukrainians, it sends a message to Ukraine and other countries, you can do whatever you want.
But just to round off on the Ukraine, so we can get on to the meat of the show, which is, of course, the Irish elections, Finbar. One thing is, since the Kursk incursion, the rest of the whole Donbass and the eastern front line is collapsing for the Ukrainians. We are, it seems, getting near the end.
That's the danger, isn't it? And the rat in a corner kind of a thing. It will do anything to try to survive. There has been talk about, and more talk, and these headlines are coming out now in things like the New York Times, hinting about the need for Zelensky to go at this stage. So there needs to be an entire regime change in Ukraine to create a safe space for negotiations and for the population there as well. You're right, the front lines every day, 2, 3, 4 settlements, as they call them, are falling along the front lines. The Russians are moving forward. They don't need North Korean troops. This trash talk about North Korean troops, which to my mind is just hilarious. It's just absolute desperation. Again, desperation on the part of Zelensky and his regime. And the Americans are not willing to talk about these so-called Korean soldiers because they're embarrassed about the lies that their friends are telling. No evidence of it whatsoever. Moving closer and closer towards the Dnieper River. And I think in all our minds over the last few years, the Dnieper seems to be the boundary at which we all expect the Russians to stop, that would be a safe area to start creating a military free zone or buffer zone between Ukraine and its provinces and Russia itself. So, they're losing big time. But again, it's what desperate acts are the Ukrainian regime going to commit over the next few months. The Russians have openly said they expect this war to be ended in 2025. So there'll be a lot of toys being thrown out of prams in the last few months of this conflict. I think it's a damn shame. It's a shame that anybody has died in this, but it's a damn shame when you know Trump's coming in, when you know they're not going to win it all now, definitely not going to win, and yet they're going to still continue to throw troops into the front line.
It's quite disgusting. That's the other thing that Lloyd, just to round the whole thing off, is there's talk in the media, we're seeing it now, there's going to be negotiations and we'll have a buffer zone and we'll put in European troops. What the West, in their arrogance, don't seem to realise is that they have no say in this. This stops when Russia says it stops. This will be on Russia's terms. The day for having terms was Istanbul in March 22. That's gone. The Russians will dictate when, how, and what the terms are. Am I right?
Yeah. No question about it, Roddy. No question about it. But this is just another example of our politicians. The politicians in the West have to prove to their own populations that they're important, that they are relevant. So they've all got an opinion about something of which they have no locus whatsoever. It's been clear, for a number of years now that this will be settled, and it will be settled on Russia's terms for very, very obvious reasons, which the West should have been aware of. The much vaunted Western sanctions, which have only led to the Russian economy booming in real terms. Amateur politicians, take the situation we've got just now. just about 150 days ago, a big stupid boy called Lammy got made the foreign minister of this country with absolutely no experience in that area whatsoever. Never been a diplomat, never been in the military, never, as far as I can kind of work out, wasn't very good in civilian life at all. Politics is perfect for Lammy, but the man doesn't understand history and he doesn't understand the power dynamics of the world. And it's actually, frankly, quite embarrassing. Well, if I felt British, it would be embarrassing. It's embarrassing to have Lammy as your foreign minister on the world stage when you compare him with the likes of Lavrov or many, many others, you know. I mean, but the fact that this man, who, you know, less than 6 weeks ago was simply a member of the parliament, suddenly now believes himself to be an international genius and expert on all matters foreign affairs and military. It's absurd. I mean, it's you know, it's like picking a name out of a Scrabble bag. You know, Lammy gets the job, and we're all the rest of the world. Lavrov's meant to sit down across the table from Lammy as an equal. Show him the respect? Does he respect the office? Does Lammy respect the office by even accepting the job in the first place? So why should anyone else give him respect? And he clearly, out of his own arrogance, his own venality as well, believes himself to be capable of being the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, when it's patently obvious to the whole world that he's not up to it.
Correct.
He is the Boris Johnson of the Labour Party, isn't he? That's the way I would.
I wouldn't. I don't think he's even that smart. You know, he's not that smart. But the thing is that it just shows in the British society, he has a posh voice and went to the right school. And if he's got a posh voice, he must be clever. But this is the same guy who said men can grow a cervix. That's what he said. And you're talking about them hoping that they know the science, Lloyd? I think not. The guy's a clown. Anyway,
to my mind, he's a race baiter as well. He's risen up on the whole issue of race and how he's representing the black community, when in reality, to my mind, he's representing the upper classes. That's who he's representing. And he's not just representing them. He's a sycophant who's forcing his way up their rectal cavity as much as he can. And it's quite clear from every utterance, as you said earlier about somebody else, is a kind of a job interview of sorts. You know, there's nothing serious about the man other than the seriousness of the role that he's in.
If David Lammy, if a family from the West Indies moved in next door to him, he'd be horrified. But there was blacks living next door to him. He'd be the local residents of tenants association. Have them removed, for goodness sake.
I can imagine him at 14 years old, a confused teenager, looking in the mirror, throwing talc on himself, trying to straighten his hair. And when that didn't work, he just decided to become a tough politician of some sort.
Yeah. You see it as this. I'm digressing completely here, but you see it particularly in America. But Lammy is a classic like that, who they become more white middle class than the white middle class. That's where he is.
A beggar on horseback. A beggar on horseback.
Exactly. Or as we call him in Glasgow, a fanny. That's what he is. But if I could move on, Finbar, to why you're here, and as I said at the beginning of the podcast, what happens in Ireland is probably more relevant to us in Scotland than what happens in the US or in England. It honestly is. It's a weather vane for us. Now, about a year ago, it's fair to say, we were all very excited that Sinn Féin looked a shoe-in. They're not so much looking like a shoe-in now, are they?
No, and there's a multitude of reasons for that. There's been a concerted campaign on the part of the bigger political parties, Fianna Fáil. Well, I can't say Fianna Fáil are not bigger than Sinn Féin anymore, but the standard political parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, Sinn Féin have had to experience a concerted hate campaign, basically, by these two parties, by the Labour Party, and by overall Irish mainstream media, who over the last 6 months in particular have been berating Sinn Féin on many issues that are completely incorrect. I don't agree with Sinn Féin on a lot of things, to be honest with you. They have gone uber woke. You're talking about sale taxes and all that kind of jazz. They're right in the middle of that whole melting pot of genderism, of supporting mass immigration, of censorship. So they wanted even stricter So the hate speech laws were not passed in Ireland. The government have put them on the back burner for now. But Sinn Féin wanted actually stricter hate speech laws. Even though those laws did not define what hate was, those laws made it very difficult to discuss anything to do with immigration, to do with gender or anything like that. And Sinn Féin wanted to double down on those laws. They've lost a lot of people because of that. They've lost a lot of people because of the refusal to engage in the discussion about how mass immigration is impacting working class communities. And that's where Sinn Féin's base came from, the working class. But over the last 5 years, Sinn Féin, in particular, Sinn Féin have tried to aspire towards the middle class vote in so many different ways. And in doing so, they've lost their identity. And it reminds me of an immigrant, somebody who leaves one country. I was talking to a young fella, I was canvassing for a candidate in Dublin at the weekend. And there was a young enough fella who was talking to me, and he spoke about the fact that he was planning to immigrate. Good qualifications, everything else. Can't get a home, country's a mess. He, like most young Irish people, is planning to immigrate to Canada. And I just made the point to him that one of the saddest things about immigration is you become a stranger in two lands. You're never fully from the land that you go to, and you will always feel a bit of a stranger. But on the other hand, if you leave for 20 or 30 years, when you come back to your own home, you're very aware of the fact that you've become a stranger there too. So there's a great sadness about immigration, and a lot of young Irish people are emigrating. And Sinn Féin are not talking about it, they're not doing anything about it. In fact, they've allowed a massive vacuum to develop, where normally they would have been the only ones with the intellect and bravery to talk about mass immigration in a balanced way, in a realistic, honest way. You would have expected Sinn Féin to do that. They're not doing it. In fact, they're some of the biggest shouters of far right. And in doing so, they're creating a far right. They've left this vacuum when everybody's afraid to talk about immigration in case they're called a Nazi or someone from the far right. And that vacuum is quickly being filled with people who have no real intellectual base when it comes to understanding politics in general, world history. They're going by things that they see on the internet. But they are right on the one thing, like a clock is right twice a day, a broken clock. They are right on the immigration thing. And some of these people are going to get, not many, but some of them are going to get elected into the next Dáil instead of Sinn Féin TDs. And that's because of the lack of bravery, the lack of willingness and maturity to be able to talk about mass immigration, where you don't have to start calling people names and labels like far right, Nazi. There is a severe mass immigration problem into this country. Hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country every year, not just refugees and through the IPAS system, although we do know up to 80% of people coming through the IPAS system, the International Protection System, are in fact destroying their documents, and they're coming from other European countries where they've been living for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And they're coming here claiming that they're coming from Palestine, claiming that they're coming from Syria and other countries. And so the government are not willing to talk about this. The media are not willing to talk about this. And so Sinn Féin are not willing to talk about it. And that vacuum is there. So there's going to be a big shake-up. There was a referendum in Ireland a couple of months ago. And one of the aspects of the referendum was taking the word mother out of the Constitution. If you read the papers, if you listen to the governing parties, and in fact all the parties, including Sinn Féin, that referendum was going to pass, no problem. It was resoundingly rejected by the Irish people, who are just not giving into wokeism anymore. So we have elections coming up where it looks like the standard governing parties are going to get in again. Sinn Féin, it looks like, is not going to do as well as it was expected 6 months ago that they would do. So, but you are going to get those independents. They're going to shake things up when it comes to immigration, but there won't, in my mind, be any fundamental change in this election. But the next election, I think, will be. If you look at the United States, the immigration issue in the United States has been rolling on now for 10, 12 years. It's only really now that it's top of the topic issue, and it's impacting and influencing how people vote in the United States. And it's given the time for people to get together. All the independent candidates in Ireland at the moment, they've had no time to coalesce. They've no time to form, norm, as it were. So they've no organization. And that's the reason why they're not going to do well. Not because people support mass immigration. The polls show that between 70 to 80% of people in this country, time and again, all the official polls show that the Irish people want much stricter immigration control. Now, if you're living in a little village, I don't know, in the north of Scotland, you may not have been impacted by mass immigration yet. You go to my town, Dundalk, walk down the street. Do not expect to meet Irish people. Every corner you go around, it gets frustrating because you look down the street and 80% of the people arrived here in the last year. 80% of them. You hardly see your own people. All the old people are afraid to go out now. It's all young men. I've known so many elderly couples in villages around the country who have stopped going into their village because it's just full of these young men. And it's not an urban issue. We've had villages in Ireland that have had the population doubled and trebled by new immigrant arrivals of all young men, desperate young men. We don't know who they are. We don't know their backgrounds. Everybody in this town where I come from now knows one or two people who've been raped over the last year and a half, sexual crime. And I wasn't believing the sexual crimes. When I was being told this, I thought, no, this is just, you can't label everybody as sexual criminals, which I still believe you can't. But I'll give you an example. I can say it here because this is a Scottish program. She won't see it. I was at a demonstration, a mass immigration demonstration in my local town of Dundalk, and I met a girl that I haven't seen in a couple of years. And she messaged me after it, the following Tuesday, to say thanks for talking at that. And I said, I'm surprised I saw you there. And she said, oh, I didn't want to go. My daughter made me go. She said, Finbar, I haven't told anybody, but X, I won't say her name, was raped 6 months ago in a bar in town by a guy, a Nigerian guy who was working making pizzas in the bar. Now, this girl rarely goes out, but she's a very shy girl, very good-looking girl. But she went out this night with her two friends. She left the bar right in the middle of our town, left the bar, walked around the corner. This guy was at the back section of the pub, and as she was walking down the road, he grabbed her and he raped her. Turns out he raped two women that night. The guys that owned the pub were employing him under the national minimum wage. So it was a labour thing. It was a cheap labour thing, really, is what was happening. So the guards went to the pub the next day. She phoned the guards, and this is another issue in Ireland. She phoned the guards that night when her daughter came home. The guards said, call back in the morning and see how she feels. No test kits, no nothing like that. Went into the guards the next morning. They went down to this pub. The guys in the pub said, yeah, we weren't employing him illegally yet. They gave the address of where he was supposed to be staying. The guards went into that, kicked the door into that apartment, found 5 different passports with 5 different names, but his face on every one of those passports. They found out that he had family in Dublin. They went to Dublin. They said that he'd got a plane to London. The guards found that he had actually booked a plane back in a few days' time to Dublin. They said that they went and they waited at the airport for him. He got on the plane in London, but he didn't get off in Dublin. Do you know what he did? Just got another passport. That's all he did, and he's back in this country. I know of a woman that was raped in one of the Ukrainian centers. I know of 2 people who escaped from Ukraine, escaped charges raping underage kids in Ukraine, and are living and are getting paid and are working and are getting everything paid for in a center here in Dundalk. So the lack of control, the lack of checks has meant that anybody and everybody, criminals are like water. If I'm a criminal and I commit a crime in an area and I know I'm persona non grata in that area, I, like water, will go the easiest route to go somewhere to create a new identity. Ireland is that place. Ireland is that place. And I'm not labeling everybody that comes into the country like that, but it is a key issue. And I wasn't believing all the sex crime stuff until people I know started to experience it. And it's very real, and we can't ignore it. We can't almost be like some kind of a strange, surreal play in which we know that our people are being abused, but we ignore it because we don't want to seem to be impolite. And that's what's happening in Ireland. The judges and the courts in Ireland are now giving directions that the media and the public are not allowed to share the names of anybody from outside of Ireland that's been convicted of anything because of the current climate. This is what the judges are saying. Not allowed to name anybody if they're convicted of something, if they're from outside of Ireland because of the current climate.
Sure. And that's affecting Sinn Féin.
Ireland, the government give out €200 to a refugee for one room, for a bedroom, for a bed, basically, right? How can a young Irish man or girl, a single person who's working, how can they compete with that? How can they? We've got a massive housing crisis. We actually have over 350,000 homeless in Ireland. The official figures are 14,000. But a number of organisations last year brought out reports showing it's over 300,000, up to 350,000 hidden homeless under the EU definition of homeless, sleeping on sofas, sleeping in makeshift sheds. All that kind of, when you count them in, we've got over 350,000 homeless. And yet, I know people, as someone who's a director of a homeless charity, I'm sitting watching as people who arrive here a few weeks ago get a house and they don't even apply for the house and they get it. And I've got mothers coming into me with 5-6 kids who've been on the housing waiting list for 12 years and they're nowhere near consideration yet. And so this is really, and the government and the political parties are pretending this is not happening. And so they're going to get a bit of a kick in the kahunas because independents are going to get, here's an example. There's a guy called the Monk, Hutch, a gangster in Dublin, bank robber his entire life. He's running in the elections in Dublin and people are so pissed that he's going to get in. He's only out of jail and he's going to get in. People are so angry with what is happening here. So, well, the strange scenario is that probably Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are going to get in again because it seems like there's no other options. Fianna Fáil have been, Fine Gael have been putting out headlines over the last week that they're going to get tougher with immigration. At the same time, they're introducing laws to make it easier for companies in Ireland to import cheap labour. Now, the refugee applications are getting all the blame for this. Well, if you mention immigration to a government representative, the first thing they will mention is IPAS, international protection. And yet, when you look at the figures, the mass majority of people coming into this country are coming in on work visas and student visas from Brazil, from India. If you go to any garage, you know the big garage companies along the motorways, every one of their employees are Indian. And they're living in houses 15 and 20 in a 3-bedroom house. And that 3-bedroom house was getting taken out of their wages. All the abattoirs in Ireland, working abattoirs used to be good quality, well-paid work. Now it's pittance. It's all people from Bulgaria and Georgia and countries like that working in our abattoirs. And the owner of the abattoir will have a big house and you'll have 100 of them living in that. He'll charge them top dollar for their rent. And so in reality, he's paying nothing for the house. In reality, the owner of the business. And so it's basically cheap slave labor practically. And all the businesses are loving it. Even the shops, because they've got 10 times as many people coming in there. And so what was Yeats say about fumbling in their greasy tills? And yet the people on the ground, because the key issue here is that most of this has been done for issues around labour, cheap labour. Oh, we need more workers. I saw a headline the other day that essentially we need to import more builders to build houses for the builders that we've just imported. And so it's this perpetual, and where's it going to stop? 10 million? 15 million? We know that the EU and the government have had secret plans to increase the population of this country to 10 million. They've been planning this over the last 10 years because they see Ireland as far too homogenous, far too underpopulated. And so that's what's happening. So the electoral results will not represent how people feel on the ground this time. But I believe that they will next time when people have more of an opportunity to get together, to separate the chaff from the wheat, as it were, and to create some political entity that's not extreme, but is mature enough to discuss these problems. So I don't know. I can't remember what your question was, but there's an overview of somebody who's living in Ireland.
Well, I was going because I'm going to go on to Lloyd's. I've got the Irish Times today, which tells me that Fine Gael's on 25%, Sinn Féin is on 19%, and Fianna Fáil's on 19%. But as has been alluded to by Finbar, the independents are now growing all the time. They're up to 20%. They shot past Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil, the independents. Quite a bizarre situation, Lloyd.
It is a bizarre situation. I mean, it was great to get Finbar's overview, but I think the fact that the election was called more or less as a snap election caught particularly the independents and some of the smaller parties kind of ill-prepared. And I was going to ask Finbar what he thought was the rationale behind Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil deciding to go for an early election. But I think what's depressing for me is that, I think the first time we spoke about the rise of Sinn Féin in the Republic and the possibility of a Sinn Féin government and the potential for a border poll, we were quite G'd up by it. But having seen the trajectory that Sinn Féin has gone on, particularly with its commitment to, for better description, the woke agenda, which, as I understand it, flies in the face of so much of their own history. But it seems to me that they're going to pay an electoral price here, and I'm kind of not surprised by it really. But what interests me is this: how come Sinn Féin has taken on board the woke agenda, the Scottish National Party took on board the woke agenda, Plaid Cymru in Wales took on board the woke agenda? Is it, what's going on here? There's clearly something bigger at play, and I don't think it's to the benefit of the populations of the countries outlined. Certainly, I met with the Sinn Féin's housing spokesman some years ago, Owen O'Brien, who seems to be the main cheerleader in Sinn Féin outside of Mary Lou herself for the woke agenda. And I don't understand it. I frankly don't understand how someone, despite the fact he's from the south, but he was a councillor in Belfast for a while. He was spent a long period of time in the Basque Country. What I don't really understand is when I've met, long-term members of Sinn Féin, you never get the impression that they like Americans, but they're not crazy about the American government. And I seem to get the impression, particularly for the likes of Owen O'Brien and to some degree some other senior figures in Sinn Féin, that their closeness to the Americans is closer to the American state than the American people as it was in the past. And I begin to think, has the woke agenda actually been a very clear product of the United States State Department or other structures around that? I'm just throwing things out here. I'm not certain, but what I don't understand is a party with the unique selling point which Sinn Féin has, tied very much to the great history of Ireland and the creation of the future history of Ireland, would effectively throw all of that, in the bin for the sake of taking up what are effectively middle-class bourgeois concepts that have no basis in reality. That, to me, is the very opposite of the founding principles of Sinn Féin. And it saddens me. I mean, I watched the leaders' debate on RTE, and there's no question Mary Lou McDonald is the best of the lot. But then you scratch the surface, and she's as woke as the wokest, and that's worrying. That really is worrying. And I don't know.
But the other one is they're also joined the EU. Ukraine, backing Ukraine, bad Russia. Sinn Féin have come in that one as well, which I find quite bizarre too.
Well, Roddy, to be honest with you, because I spent a brief period in the professional world of politics, I kind of look at this and go, they're being pragmatic. There must be something in it for them that they're not talking about this. Because that's been the history of Sinn Féin in my lifetime. Remember, I'm a bit like yourself. We're all people, we knew the war. We saw the war begin, we've seen the war end. And we're 20 years later after the war. And I don't recognise in the current Sinn Féin the principles that even last year I believed they could hold to. It's very difficult for me to understand exactly what is going on here. If Sinn Féin goes into a border poll and a woke agenda, what's the likelihood of the fundamentalist unionists in the north going along with that purely on the concept of the woke agenda? And then, forget the United Ireland stuff. I mean, to them, and particularly those who have a very, very religious bent, to me, you look at Sinn Féin, you think, who decided that you should become the disruptor party? Who was it that decided that Sinn Féin should shoot itself in its own foot? Because that's what it looks like to me from the outside, despite the fact that, I genuinely believe Mary Lou McDonald is head and shoulders above the lot of them, with the possible exception of Claire Daly. you know, certainly in terms of presentation, the way that I watch her interact with people, and she's fantastic with people. She's one of the best I've ever seen in real terms. The way she can go into any kind of situation and she just chats. She's your manny. It works brilliantly. But what I don't understand is the blind spot. Where the blind spot of the
hasn't she got a member of her family who's trans? That's what I heard. Yeah. Can you enlighten us in that, Finbar?
I heard that as well. She's also surrounded by Big Pharma. I think she's married into Big Pharma, and some of her siblings are in high up in Big Pharma. That's another explainer. Remember, the Mary Lou McDonald is not an out-and-out Republican. She was a member of Fianna Fáil. She was a career politician. When she didn't get up fast enough in Fianna Fáil, she jumped ship to Sinn Féin. That's what happened with her. And she has those qualities of being able to chat. But you know something? 80% of the people I meet going down the street and on the way to work have those qualities too. They're like a mammy, and they can have a chat. You know, but that's what they used with her. She's a career politician. That being the case, she will do and say anything to advance her career. That's the reality of it. Now, Sinn Féin had 10 years ago, they started to lie to themselves. And they were saying, you know something? We'll say nothing on that, and we'll say nothing on that, because it's all about a united Ireland. That's the real key plan. But they've been so busy saying nothing on those issues and are actually advancing those woke issues that they've actually forgotten all about the united Ireland thing. And now they're all about those issues. That's what they have become. They have become the defenders of the sexualization of children in schools, primary school children in schools. And they're come out angrier than anybody else in their defense of these things. You know, so there's a lot of soul searching needs to be done in Sinn Féin after these elections. I think Mary Lou McDonald will probably be gone after the election. I don't know who's there to replace her. Now, there is a little party called Aontú, which means change in Ireland. And Aontú so their leader was Padar Tobin, who broke away from Sinn Féin on the issue of abortion. But they're pretty strong on immigration. They're very understanding. They're empathetic. They're not angry about immigration. They're practical about immigration. They're willing to have a mature conversation about it. The same with the sexualization of children in primary school, on the gender issue. They see the insanity in it, and they're willing to have a mature conversation about it. So I was talking to some people in the shop today in work, just on my lunch break, and they all come up to me. I'm well known locally for having opinions and things. So a lot of the younger people particularly come up and they say, who will I vote for, Finbar? Who will I vote for? And so listening to them, what I was gauging was they don't want to go with a lot of the independents because they think they're a bit nutty, or they only know them on one issue. They feel gutted that they feel they can't vote for Sinn Féin. They feel almost like they've lost a family member. Some of them, they actually looked really upset at the idea that we're finding it so difficult to vote for Sinn Féin. But I made the point to them that Aontú seems to be the fixer here. Aontú would be quite conservative in its pronouncements. So you certainly couldn't see them as radical. I know some Aontú party leaders quite high up. I would have regular conversations with some of them, and I would see them as emerging as an option for people who don't want to go for independence that they're unsure about, that they're one issue independence, and that they feel they can't vote for Sinn Féin anymore. So I think Aontú over time will build up as a significant power within Irish politics. But the only thing about Aontú is they need to open up more. I think they're very internally centrally controlled. Their message is very controlled, and I understand the need to control the message, but they're going to have to loosen up a bit, lighten up to get more members in. But I see the future in parties like Aontú. I don't see necessarily that we're going to have to wait another 4 to 5 years for an election. I have a feeling that once these elections are over, the sellotape and the rubber bands are going to be taken off the car that is Ireland, and it's going to start falling apart after these elections. And another thing just to point out to you is that the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Green government had a massive giveaway in the last budget a few weeks ago. You're talking about the timing of the elections, straight after a budget in which over the weeks of the election, there will be 3 extra payments made to pensioners, bonuses. There'll be 3 extra payments made to mothers. You know, so this is what they're at, and the Irish people are foolish enough to a degree to fall for that. You know, I've listened to people say things like one woman said to me a few weeks ago, but don't we treat our elderly so well? Aren't our elderly so well and so landed? I go, yeah, they get a pension of 250 quid a week and they get fuel allowance. So yeah, that's okay. But it's when they go to hospital, that's the problem. And they're euthanized in hospital. That could be a problem. That there's an extra 5 years taken off their life. That they that many of these older people are still paying off loans that they took out 15 years ago for their kids who got in trouble with their mortgage. And so they're still heavily indebted. A lot of those old people now have had these electricity boxes put into their houses. So although they get the allowance, they're still throwing money in. And some of them are still at the end of the week, they're out of electricity and they're have to make a choice between paying the milkman or throwing that extra few coins into the electricity box. So yeah, they get the 230 quid, they get the fuel allowance, and they've generally got free healthcare. But after that, it's the bigger issues that are affecting them. The fact that they feel they can't go into their local urban area anymore for fear, because they're surrounded by men from different countries who don't speak the language, who at times it can appear to be quite desperate in their presentations. You know, so it's typical Parish pump politics. But again, they tried it and they did it with zest at the last budget by giving out those extra payments. So overall, I think it's going to be a similar government to the last one. The minor coalition party will change. It may not be the Greens. I think they're going to get decimated because they are the vanguard of wokeism in Ireland and across Europe. The Green, it's amazing. It's amazing how the Greens were co-opted and taken over by this cabal of nutcases that's driving wokeism. So the Greens, I think, are going to be out. They have a minister at the moment, Roderick O'Gorman, is probably one of the most despised men in Ireland. He claims that people don't like him because he's gay. Nothing to do with the woke agenda that he's been driving everywhere. Nothing to do with the lies that he's told to people publicly. For instance, at that referendum about women in the Irish Constitution, he, first of all, withheld the Attorney General's guidance to the state on it, which was that there were going to be serious problems with it. One of the problems that the Attorney General raised was the issue of the fact that if we take women out of the Constitution and we also dilute the meaning of what marriage means to the fact that polygamous marriages would be accounted for, you can see the problem when it comes to immigration and polygamy coming in here. And so at the moment, there's a whole industry of people claiming that they have children in other countries. And they take in these adult children, which they're allowed to take lots of them in. But it's actually they're getting paid. That's not their children. They're getting paid to take in the whole family members, extended family members you're allowed to take into this country now. One application had over 70 family members. So when you see the figures today of 100 and X thousand, well, we'll just talk about iPass. When you see the figures of 25,000 iPass last year, every one of them have come here with the intention of bringing their extended family over here. And they'll tell you that because they're interviewed. There's people walk down the street and hold up a camera and talk to them. And the ones that have good English will tell you this. I'm a director of a charity in town. We were looking for voluntary workers, you know, with these work schemes that the state does, community work schemes. And so we had communicated with one of these schemes. They said, yes, we have a woman who's going to come in. She is for an interview. She is Somalian by birth, and but she has perfect conversational English, we were told. We waited at the charity for her to come with the TUS, the organisation that was arranging this for us, with their worker. When a car pulled up, a fancy car, two people got out, a young woman and an older woman, both of them wearing hijabs, which is no issue for me. They come into the shop. The older woman who had applied for the job did not have one word of English, but we were told she had perfect conversation in English. Her daughter had come to translate. I asked her daughter where she had come from. She had been in Sweden for the last 10 years working with a home, but she was told that conditions in Ireland were much better. So she upsticked in Sweden with her family and she came to Ireland. You know?
There you go.
And she will get a house automatically before an Irish person has been on the housing waiting list for 10 years. Probably won't even have to apply for it.
Shocking.
If you can't see that as a key stick to stoke racism, when you look at the work of Hannah Arendt, for instance, Hannah Arendt, she escaped Germany, Nazi Germany. She had experienced both under communism and under the Nazis. She became, I believe, one of the most profound philosophers of the 20th century. And she wrote about totalitarianism. She wrote about hate. She wrote about politics and all those issues. And in her Origins of Totalitarianism, she spoke about, and she was Jewish herself, she spoke about the phenomenon of how the Jews became despised in Germany. And she said that the main reason was that they became viewed as a group of the population who had assets, who were looked after, but didn't have a purpose in society. And that's how hate can be fomented against groups in society. When we look at the mass immigration coming in here, what the Irish people are perceiving, many of them are working and getting all this money. So they're coming in here and they're allowed to work now. So they come in here, they're getting their rent paid for 200 quid a week. They're getting funds, they'll get grants for businesses, all this stuff. Plus they're allowed to work while they're receiving this. So the Irish people are looking at this and they're saying to themselves, well, here's groups of people who don't seem to have a purpose in the state, but seem to be just taking from the state. And it really, really fits the pattern that Hannah Arendt had outlined in terms of how things like Nazism and hate towards the Jews arose in Germany. But here's the thing. We are now 80 years since World War II. We're nearly a century since the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. There have been volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of books written about how the Nazis rose and what stoked the people in Germany to turn against Jewish people, amongst others. We haven't learned a thing, because we're doing the very same in Ireland today, when we take groups in the population and we put them into special categories and we give them more and we give them a perceived lifestyle of ease. I'm not saying they have a lifestyle, I'm saying that's the perception that the working class people on the ground are getting. When we have no school places right across the country, we've run out of teachers now right across the country. I can come from Ukraine. So here's an example. I know a person, a business person in town, and they, a friend of mine, and they've taken in a young Ukrainian student, and 200 quid a week for that room that he's in. He was able to come to Ireland and without any exams, go straight into a college place in Ireland without having to meet any requirements whatsoever, because he came from Ukraine. So what happened was, people who studied their arse off for the last 4 and 5 years to get that place, Irish people, to get that place in college, were denied that place because somebody came from Ukraine. Now, here's the thing. Hey, that lad's family are still in Ukraine and come over to visit him every few weeks. The older people from the family, the younger kids from the family. They're purely here to take advantage of the free educational system. In this instance, how could the Irish people not start getting pissed off at that?
No, you're quite right. Listen, the clock's beating us. We're getting down. I'd just like to wrap up, if I may, Lloyd. Listening to Finbar, not so much on the immigration side, but on the Sinn Féin, who have seemed to have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. There are a lot of parallels between them and the SNP, and also the politician, the Green politician, being the most hated in Ireland. Have you heard of Patrick Harvey, Finbar? We've got one of them as well that's greatly despised. But there are great parallels. We were riding the crest of the wave with the SNP. Sinn Féin looked as if they were going to get, become the government, border poll, break up the union. That's what we were looking for and looking forward to. But it seems they've shot themselves in the foot the exact same way as the SNP have done, by going into wokeism and straying from their one job, their one task. They've gone down rabbit holes. The Sinn Féin have done the exact same. There are huge parallels here.
Yes, there are. There are huge parallels, and that's why I suggested earlier that, where does this all fit in a kind of global sense or a European sense? I think what Finbar said is absolutely correct as well, Roddy. I don't think that this, after this election, the government will serve, the Irish government, of whatever colour it is, will serve a full term. I think there's an instability has developed. And I think there will be an element of fluidity. I mean, I bow to Finbar's greater knowledge on these matters, but looking at it from the outside and taking into account many of the things that he's saying, I think we mustn't put all our eggs in the single basket. We can't depend on the single event. I've been talking about this in terms of Scotland and the movement for independence for a while now, that we see the event coming, we expect that event to deliver what we want. What we were hoping for is, if there is a Sinn Féin government, then there'd be a commitment to a border poll, and that we in some ways would be able to piggyback on that campaign for the border poll. that doesn't look like it's happening now. We need to reassess where we're at. And in some ways, it comes back to the same thing. If we depend on the single event, then we're always going to wake up with a hangover the next morning. What we need to do is we need to prepare for the event, take on the event, and be prepared to lose so that we win next time round. I was really interested in what Finbar said about Onto. I remember when they first came on the scene, and I think the kind of main spokesman was Jerry McGill, who had one of those extraordinary individuals who came out of the Republican movement after many years in jail, but with an intellect. And I remember being caught a bit like I am by Tommy McKierney as well. These very, very inspirational thinkers that came from the Republican movement that now, as from what Finbar's been saying, they seem to have been put in a cupboard. Sinn Féin doesn't want those thinkers anymore, and that's another comparison with us here in Scotland and between Sinn Féin and the Scottish National Party. Scottish National Party has spent the past decade driving out any support from any intellectual base whatsoever, either from within the party or from out with it. So yeah, watch this space. Are Sinn Féin becoming the SNP? Could be.
I think so. That's, gentlemen, as I say, the clock has beaten us. I've enjoyed as always, Finbar. I should just ask you one question and just go and get myself a coffee and then come back and say goodbye. You're wonderful with your knowledge and what you bring to us. We really appreciate it very much. And you as well, Lloyd, nice to see you back. And I know our viewers have missed you, but hopefully you'll be back this weekend too. We hope. And I hope you will be too, folks. So until we see you again, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.